Hello, Houston. We're now just barely past the 2/3 mark in the course. We have an exam after the last set of lectures, and now we're going to be dealing with the remaining portion of the course itself. What I'd like to do is review a couple of deadlines with you, not in terms of specific dates, because this tape is used for several semesters, as you know, but your independent project is going to be due toward the latter portion of this part of the course itself, and normally, roughly lecture 24 is the mark to keep your eye on. There will be in the syllabus that you have a specific date by which it has to be either postmarked or delivered to my office. I don't care which way you do it. It's just the idea that everybody should have essentially the same length of time to work on the project. So either put it in the post office with a postmark or give it to me. I don't care which way you do that. Secondly, I am in the process of organizing what we're going to cover on the last lecture, and I wanted to turn to you for suggestions. If there's anything you'd like me to recover or talk about more extensively, you could get word to me. In addition, I would also like to forewarn those of you who are in this particular semester, that is when we're taping it, and that is what I'd like to do is the deadline this particular semester for due dates of the projects is a little closer to the last lecture time than I like to have it in this particular taping semester. What I'd like to do, if you have what looks like, in your own mind at least, an interesting project, if you could get it in early or get an advance copy to me, what I'd like to do is allow time in the final lecture for some number of you, anywhere between 3 and 6 or 8, to come in with your project and describe, at least briefly for people, what you did and what the apparent effects were in that case, just so that in the future students will have the ability, as you did, to go back and look at the last lecture from the previous cycle and see what's actually, what's been done in the past and what seems to have worked. So if you think you've got a creative project, let us know, and we will be grading very rapidly when they do come in, and we may call you if you don't call us. It would be helpful if you could put a phone number on in fact, that's true any semester. If you could put a phone number contact on your project when you turn it in, it's very helpful if there's any difficulty with it, that we can reach you either through email or by your telephone and so forth. But if you've got an interesting project, let us talk to you about it. Okay, so today we're starting what is for me basically the most interesting part of the entire course, and we're going to be looking at a variety of different topics, one of which of course is communication, which we'll be starting with today. It'll be perception that we're dealing with today. Then we'll be looking into interpersonal communication. Thirdly, what we'll do is to analyze after social influence. We'll be looking then at basically friendship and love, how that impacts our particular lives. And then finally, we'll be looking at marriage, love, or I should put it the other way around, love, marriage, and intimate relationships. So we'll cover a variety of things, but if I had the wrong label up there, let me just correct it, and that is what we're going to be dealing with today, starting today, is person perception. And that has I can talk for 2 hours about this and not even repeat myself once in going through this. But do you remember the Holmes and Raw scale that we talked about in terms of the impact of various events on the everyday lives that we lead? Well, it was interesting that if you go back and look at the various events of which that scale was originally constituted, a lot of them are basically social in nature. And that includes things like a son or daughter leaving home from the perspective of a parent, troubles with the in-laws from the perspectives of various marital partners, or the death of a close friend for male or female. That observation of the social natures of those factors is really quite interesting when you contrast it with the often expressed lamentation that students, listen to me, that people who are nearing death often will tend to express, and that is one of the most commonly expressed lamentations of gee, I wish I'd, has to do with the fact that you didn't spend as much time, people nearing death didn't spend as much time with loved ones and family as they really intended to, that their heart was at home and they simply didn't express it, as busy as they were with their jobs here, there, and yonder. But that is but one example of the kind of perception of ourselves that we're going through in that kind of retrospective on what our life happens to be. And in terms of that, let me simply start by defining one of the various kinds of, or the general process, and that is essentially social perception, which we define essentially as involving the process, the act, or the faculty of becoming aware of other persons as they relate to yourself. That's essentially what is involved in social perception. Over the last third of a century, there's a large group and a large number and a growing literature that has developed around a relatively simple concept, and that has to do essentially with how do we perceive ourselves and others in the various social interactions that we're involved in. We all do it. We do it in person with members of our family, with significant others, with friends, acquaintances, and even fellow workers. But we also do it more abstractly in terms of, for instance, in absentia, with people that are in the news or various kinds of movie or television stars, actors in dramas. If you've listened to folks in Hollywood who have had an established role for a period of time, they will often be addressed by people in the public as if they are personally the role that they were playing in a given drama. In that situation, we kind of attribute to those people the particular attributes and so forth that are simply an element of the role that the actor or actress happens to be playing in a given situation. Overall, what we're going to deal with is the attribution process itself, and we're going to define that in a couple of different ways for you. One is to talk about it essentially as the process by which an event or a person's behavior is understood and interpreted in terms of suggested motives or influences. That's one way in which we attribute particular orientations to a given individual. But there's another way to do it, slightly different in expression here, and that is to define it instead as the judgment that any person or event has specific characteristics or qualities. That's one of the consequences of social attribution in this kind of a situation. The process is all around us. Juries do it. Essentially, they attribute responsibility or lack of responsibility for actions of people on trial, as but one example. A business person makes a decision as to whether to develop and continue to support a particular product based on his or her own attributions to his customers, her customers, whether the customer base is likely to support the continuing maintenance of access to a particular product or something like that. And the question then is, well, what are the pertinent variables that are involved in that situation? And we'll show you a number of those, but they start out with basically what we would call internal attributes. And those are essentially what we would call dispositions. You could refer to them as dispositional attributions if you want to put a lot of TIONs together. If you get a good grade, you credit your inherent smartness, don't you, as the reason for getting a good grade. Well, what you're engaged in there is what is defined in the literature as essentially a dispositional attribution, and that is a belief that a person's behavior, your behavior in that case, or experiences are caused by their character or personality. That is, by internal characteristics of their personality. You view yourself as smart, and that's the reason you got the good grade on the most recent test, as one example of a dispositional attribution. Typically, this typically occurs, that is, when we're judging or analyzing the causes of our own behavior. And on the other hand, that leads directly into a second way to define attribution, a second kind of emphasis to put here, and that is to talk essentially about external attribution in terms of what is called a situational attribution. If you get a good grade, your friends will say that it occurred because you're a friend of the teacher, or you mowed his or her grass, or you washed their car, or in fact, you always wear the teacher's favorite color. That's various ways in which friends may look at your good grade and say, well, it's because of, he or she was buttering up him or her, the teacher. And we define that then as situational attribution, and we define it simply as a belief that a person's behavior or experiences arise from the environment in which they find themselves or create for themselves. Okay? This typically occurs when we're judging or analyzing the causes of other people's behaviors. Our own we make as a dispositional attribution. The behavior of others we tend to attribute to instead to the situation that's been created. Think about it in terms of investment. If you invest in a stock and the company experiences major losses, there are a couple of different ways as a stock owner that you can analyze that. Are you more or less likely to invest more money in the company if you blame its performance on the officer's skills That would be an example of a distributional attribution. You're blaming the officers and how they behaved for the company's demise in this particular situation. Or are you more or less likely to invest more money in that company if you blame its performance on the economic times in which the company is operating? It's just, these are rough times. There's no doubt that the company has lost some value, but we can attribute that to the economics, the hard economic times. That would be an example of a situational attribution. Same company, same decline in behavior, but in one case you're attributing it to the officers, and in the other case you're attributing it to the general environs in which the company is forced to operate. So which attribution you reach is going to directly impact your behavior, and that's one of the reasons I want to spend some time looking at this process of attribution. Whiten, Lloyd, Dunn, and Hammer, I need to talk to them about shortening that to a one-author team, I think. But what they do is to point out that someone with an internal locus of control is much more likely to blame depression or lack of success in love on their own failings. You will hear them offer statements essentially like, nothing I do matters. Okay, that would be an example of an internal attribution in a particular lack of success. On the other hand, another source of attribution is basically the results of your past experiences. You may have heard other friends saying things like, once burned, twice foolish. And it suggests essentially the role of experience in impacting your own attributional process and who you should get involved with. We learn how to make particular kinds of attributions in a given situation. So for instance, one of the types of attributions that we make is what we'll call essentially social comparison. Sitting in class, have you ever compared yourself with other students in the class? Not overtly going up and asking people, but rather in the abstract in terms of, comparing yourself with person X or person Y or person Z and thinking to yourself, well, I've got a thus and so and he or she has got a such and such in your imagination. Given these figures, what do you suppose are the odds that you have in fact been part of somebody else's comparison group when that kind of a comparison can be made? And in essence, we do that all the time. The media also is constantly summarizing the various bases for comparison that we can use in various kinds of situations. At various times, the media has talked about males or females in terms of the average weight of members of a given sex. What proportion of us smoke, another factor we tend to talk about, are overweight, are on a diet, are on a particular kind of diet, drive sports cars, vote Democratic. All of those are examples of ways in which we involve ourselves in social comparison and get interested in the data of how many of us are Republican, how many are Democratic, how many drive a sports car, how many drive a sedan, and so forth and so on. All of those are bases for social comparison. We're comparing our own particular set of circumstances against the norms established by the behaviors of others. We also have feedback from friends and family as another source of basis for social comparison. That is, as we behave in a general situation, we're watching the reactions that we get from others. And to a certain extent, we tend to modify our behavior in a particular way. The sources range, but they're predictable. For an elementary school student, preschool and elementary school, the main source, of course, is the parents. But as school grows, that is, as a student's involvement in school is lengthened, what happens is that increasingly the peers become the comparison group, especially in school, but to a lesser extent always, and even when you're 40, 50, 60, you're comparing yourself against fellow workers in a given environment, wherever you happen to be employed, and so forth. In other cases, we use television as the norm. When the most recent president and wife were elected to office, because you really in some ways elect a pair, design features in clothing changed as a function of the fact that the wife of most presidents is a fashion icon anyway. She tends to be particularly oriented toward clothing and how she presents herself, given that she's the wife of a politician. And that change, that new model, whoever the new first lady is, tends to impact fashion among females, just as a natural consequence of the social comparison that we all engage ourselves in. So the feedback then from family and friends is a source of it's the master against which we compare ourselves in this kind of a situation. We look at social factors in general, television as a reflection of what's going on in society in a given situation. Various biases that we may have or that others may have can also impact what we compare ourselves to. Positive feedback means that we respond to it immediately. Negative feedback, when we get it in terms of what we're wearing or trying to wear or trying to adopt as a new habit or something, we tend to suppress or ignore. So when people reinforce what we're doing, we tend to be very positive toward it. When it's a deliberate campaign on our part and people don't like it or react negatively to it, we tend to suppress it for a while, maybe gather more data before making a final decision about how to act in a given situation. There are more generally then also some cultural influences that can impact us in terms of, if you think, for instance, what major features in an individual are valued, I should say, by Americans. Make it even easier, are valued by Texans. What we tend to do is focus on things like individuality. We enjoy that in fellow Texans. Competitive skill. Success, another thing that Houston itself tends to run on a lot. Dedication, commitment, strength of character, of body, anything like that are features that we tend to identify with Texans as positive attributes. What about stereotypes? Another example of cultural influences that you know, what do you think of when I simply say the word woman? What's the model that pops to mind when you say woman? To a certain extent, that's sex role governed. There's a whole package not only of how we look physically, male and female, but there are also various behaviors that are expected of us by virtue of being man or woman. And those are basically aspects. They're stereotypes essentially, but it's that against that influences the kind of behavior that we aspire to. These kind of norms essentially limit or encourage our participation in particular kinds of activities or non-participation in them. Our definitions of success, indeed our definitions of self. In that package of attributions, there are some other needs that also crop up that become a topic of interest in and of themselves here. One of them has to do with the need for consistency, and I'm going to define that in a couple of different ways because it's such a complex topic that it's generated a lot of research in psychology. But if I raise for you a particular issue here as an example of a cognitive factor, would you describe yourself as being smart and consistent in the way in which you handle your workload? Most of us would automatically say yes. Well, of course I am. But it's interesting. You may remember the activity that I had you do at the beginning of the semester where I asked you to keep track of yourself for a week in 30-minute increments. Not detail minute by minute, but 30-minute increments or recordings of what you were actually doing. And over the years, I did that assignment first time on an inspiration years ago, and it worked so well that I have done it every semester ever since, basically. And one of the things that supports me doing that in terms of paying attention to the public is that I cannot tell you how many different times people have come up to me and expressed surprise about the lack of sleep they're getting, the amount of time they are or not spending studying, or the amount of time they spend commuting or looking for a parking place here at the University of Houston. There are a lot of different ways in which people will kind of look at the formal description of what they do with their lives, and it becomes quite revealing in that kind of a situation. So although we tend to think of ourselves as organized, if you really back off and look at what you're actually doing, if you think about it a minute, wouldn't it be the case that sometimes you're actually right to the deadline before you get a project done? To a certain extent, that's indicative of a lack of organization or a lack of forethought, a lack of ability to if an assignment is given in January, here you are in early April, or an assignment given in September, and here you are in early November. Finally getting around to doing that work, even though it's been on your cognitive list for a long time to actually get the job done. And so you attribute that to I'm not very well organized as the kind of summary in that case. That's a dispositional attribution that you're making in that case. You're claiming lack of organization internally as an example. On the other hand, if you attribute that to statements, hear yourself making statements like, professors really load the work on at the end of a semester. In that case, that's a situational attribution. It's the other person's fault. They're heaping it on me. In fact, wouldn't it be really more appropriate to say that you are usually well organized, maybe than that you're always well organized, as a more accurate description of your current status in a given situation? So we strive for consistency in our behavior and in our opinions of ourselves, the cognitions on which we base our decisions and so forth. Not only in forming rules to describe our behavior, but also in terms of the behavior that we manifest itself. Well, that general statement has actually been the basis for a long and interesting series of studies over the years that is referred to generally as cognitive dissonance. This is one of those areas in psychology that really had a specific starting point, and that was a publication by Leon Festinger back in 1957, in which he proposed essentially a theoretical explanation for how we go about resolving differences or inconsistencies in our behavior, and we all have them, with an emphasis on choice as an example. In order to get into this, let me just define a couple of points for you here specifically relative to cognitive dissonance. And so when we talk about cognition, what we're talking about here is knowledge, opinions, or beliefs about the environment, about ourself, or about our behavior in a given situation. Secondly, related to that, the other concept that I want to introduce is the idea of dissonance. And by dissonance, what I mean is essentially an aversive state that has drive properties. You will understand, I think, in greater detail and be able to identify in your own behavior examples of what I'm talking about when I get done with some examples here. But essentially, cognitive dissonance is said to exist essentially when you become aware of inconsistencies. It's an awareness of inconsistencies among two or more cognitions and or beliefs. That was just a hard definition for me to write because in essence I've got too many ands and ors. But the point is essentially that you can experience cognitive dissonance if you have two beliefs that are inconsistent with each other. Okay, that's one example, but you can have two behaviors that are inconsistent with each other. Or you can have beliefs and behaviors which are at odds with each other. I believe this, but I'm acting that way. All of those can lead to cognitive dissonance. So it's a kind of a hard concept, but I'm really talking about both cognitions and the beliefs that accompany them, or in some cases fail to accompany the actions that you actually see. The solution to cognitive dissonance, which is described essentially as an inherently uncomfortable state. We don't enjoy being in a dissonant state on any issue, really. The easiest, of course, is essentially to change perception or interpretation or your subjective feelings or attitudes or belief in a given situation. If you're behaving in a given situation and you think you believe differently, the easiest thing to do is just change the belief. Another possibility is essentially to reevaluate the chosen alternative and find it more acceptable. When you're behaving in a different way, simply reevaluate it and raise its value. As but one example of this way of resolving cognitive dissonance, any parent will understand the wisdom of if you have a child that's acting up, and all kids get crosswise every now and again. Parents want one thing, kid wants another. And one of the things that I found really very effective in managing my own children's behavior was that when they were particularly, they got up in a bad mood or whatever, and it was essentially an orientation that you needed to change to be more positive so they were more pleasant to live with, what I often did was give them an assignment of smiling. I don't care how bad you feel today about the fact that we can't do this or you have to do that or whatever, but I want you to smile. And that turns out, in my own experience, to have been in child raising, to have been a very effective way to get people to change. Because in fact, when they're walking around mad with a smile on their face, it's an inconsistency. It's essentially creating a cognitively dissonant pattern of behavior in their case. They're walking around inside fuming about whatever's happening or not happening in their lives, and yet they've got a smile on their face. And the net result is you've created cognitive dissonance as a director of kids' behaviors in that case. And the intent is deliberate. And that is that you get them behaving in a way that is consistent with what you're desiring out of them. And you essentially leave it to them to work it out. That, well, now it's kind of stupid for me to be walking around smiling when I'm annoyed. And so eventually, since we're encouraging them to smile, they have to end up getting their behavior kind of readjusted. So essentially, you're using the annoying feature of cognitive dissonance to encourage a child to correct his or her behavior in that kind of a situation. Another possibility when you're in a cognitively dissonant state is to expose yourself to information with which to alter the view, that is, find ways to believe the more positive behavior or the more positive belief, whatever belief it is that you're trying to change yourself into. Inconsistent behavior causes no dissonance only if the subject thinks that he or she has no choice in a given situation. I had to do it because, and there's an external source named, or if there is an external justification, if there's an obvious external reason why you have to behave in a given way that's inconsistent with your beliefs, that will also prevent you from experiencing internally cognitive dissonance. Give you an example. One of my favorite studies in the history of psychology involves the idea that, consider the situation where you're actually doing a boring task for an hour. Okay, you've been brought into the lab and you've done a task that is just consummately boring. Suppose you've been given 4 slips of paper that have consistency of tissue paper, you know, like Christmas gifts or holiday gifts are wrapped in, and you've got like 3/4-inch round circles of this, and you're given just a stack of these little slips of paper and the assignment to sort them into 4 bins, 4 little cups, you know, one for pink, one for yellow, one for green, one for blue, all of them pastel, so that it's hard. You have to look at it twice to make sure you know which color, and then you have to get them all separated out. So it's just a boring task. For an hour, you do this. And at the end of the hour, the researcher comes in, thanks you for participating, and then, here's the hooker. In one situation, pays you, the original study involved $20 under the high condition, but this was done back in 1957. If you adjust cost of living, the subject was being paid on the order of $100 to $150 for an hour of work. And in that case, there's no dissonance, okay? You've been paid $150 for doing a boring job. Yeah, it was boring, but you got $150. Now comes the hooker. What they ask you to do is, for that fee, would you please tell the next subject how enjoyable this experience is, because we're trying to study motivational condition. You were in the neutral condition, but the next subject happens to be, by random assignment, in the positive condition. So we would really like to create a positive experience in this, a positive orientation in getting this person started. So you've been paid $150 to lie to a fellow student. That creates cognitive dissonance. And you're stuck with trying to resolve it, which is in fact the reason the study was set up to begin with. But the only way to get out of that is to actually reevaluate your analysis of the task. You begin to think in terms of, well, let's see, you know, it does spread money out into the student population, and I was paid a lot of money for just sitting there sorting papers. And you can rationalize all of a sudden why you're now telling a fellow student whom you have no reason to lie, creating that cognitive dissonant state in you. You have to snap your own cognitions back into line so that your behavior, lying to a fellow student about how enjoyable the task is, the only way to resolve that cognitive dissonance is to change your opinion of the task. On the other hand, in another situation, the subject was paid only, what was it, $1 back in 1957. By modern times, cost of living, it would be about $6 or $7, but it was it was like an hourly fee that they were given. And in that situation, the subject will I'm misspeaking here. Let me correct that. I missed one thing in my notes as I went through that. When you're paid $150, there is no cognitive dissonance, okay? You've been paid a fee for performing a boring task. It was boring, but you got a lot of money. No problem. Okay, and so you can, given that that's the likely outcome, you can lie to a person about that. It does not cause you problems because you see the ultimate benefit of what you've done. You've been bought, although it doesn't look that way. It's easy to rationalize. But when you're paid only $4 or $5 or $6 or $7 an hour's worth of wage, now you've got a problem. And there's where the cognitive dissonance will occur. Let me make that clear again, and that is that if you've performed a boring task for an hour, been paid a lot of money for it, and are then asked as part of that responsibility to convince the subject of the next person in line of the worth of the experiment. For a big fee, no cognitive dissonance. You're simply performing a service for a fee rendered. No problem. But on the other hand, if you're paid a pittance and asked to lie, now you've got cognitive dissonance and you have to work on it. That's one of my favorite examples of cognitive dissonance as a state. And it generated some really interesting literature in the initial discussion of what we mean by cognitive dissonance. Another kind of general need that we talk about in terms of consistency has to do with causative factors, what it is that leads to the various kinds of issues that we're talking about here, the need for consistency and so forth. Bernard Weiner did about a 20-year run of studies in the 70s and 80s that they really introduced another dimension to the causative attributions that he gives, in which he identifies two different other types of factors that are involved here. One of them has to do with essentially what he called stability instability in the particular situation. Okay, this is independent of the internal external dimensions I was talking about before. Internally, we can be either stable or unstable as one dimension that we need to talk about. And the second one has to do with well, in fact, let me just identify here that when we're talking about stable factors, what we're talking about is permanent factors that are unchanging over time, that may influence our attributions. And I'll give you some examples of these specifically, but there are features of you and I that are simply stable. They're unchanging. We are always male, we are always female, and so forth. That's an example of a stable factor. An unstable factor, on the other hand, are those that are variable factors that are changing or can change. They're subject to change in our everyday lives or our abilities in a given situation. And so that was one example of what he talked about. And so the stability-instability factor is basically a given dimension. The other one that he also talked about is essentially combining it with the internal-external that I was talking about a little bit earlier. Now let me give you some examples of what he's talking about here by way of the model that he proposed. And that is that if the causes range between unstable and stable, let's suppose that we deal with an internal cause which is unstable. That would involve things like, for instance, how strongly motivated are you to perform a particular kind of task? Okay, how distracted are you by other factors in your environment? That would be another unstable factor that is internal. It's just a feature of you in a given situation. Have you done the experiment or whatever task you're involved in enough so that you're bored with it? Have you been doing it enough so that you're tired? Your fatigue level is high. All of those are unstable factors that will vary from time to time, but they're internal to you individually. The second general group are factors that are stable and also internal. And that would include things like, for instance, your overall ability level. Intelligence would be another example of something that is reasonably stable. If you're considered to be bright, you're always going to be bright in a given situation. If you're dull, you're going to be dull in every situation. But that's an internal attribute of you and I that doesn't change very much day to day. And we can kind of organize our life around those kind of features as a second of four examples that I want to give you here. The third has to do with unstable features that are external to you and I. We don't control things like what anybody would call luck. Gee, you were lucky in whatever happens. You know, if any of you play the lottery, that's an example of luck in the classic definition. You never know when you're going to win or whether you're going to win. The roles of chance can be another factor in gambling situations, and finally, just the very opportunity itself that you create for yourself and avail of yourself or don't is unstable. It will change from time to time, but it has to do with the particular environment in which you find yourself and choose to respond. And then finally, the last are the stable features, which in fact are external to you. And those include things like, in business, for instance, the location of your store is a fixed external factor. You can't move the store. Most companies can't. So you're stuck with the business location that you're in a given situation. And we talked earlier about another example, and that is the economy in which you have to operate your business. That's another example of an unchanging factor that is external to you. You and I personally don't directly control the economy. So those are kind of the examples of stable and unstable factors that impact the way in which we attribute our own behavior and analyze the behavior of others in a given situation. This going back to the work of Weiner in a rather creative way. And then finally, there's another factor that is also introduced here, and that has to do with controllability. That is, in career development, this one is a much easier one to summarize for you, but in career development, we refer to this factor as a chance factor, okay, to a certain extent. For instance, you control how long you choose to be in school. That's ultimately up to you, whether you choose to educate yourself and stop before high school, in high school, complete college, whatever. You choose. That's a controllable factor. You decide how long you're going to stay in school. On the other hand, you do not control who happens to be in school with you, who becomes your colleague, who in fact may become a work partner, or in fact a lifetime friend. And those are examples of variability along a controllability, uncontrollability factor. And the same elements essentially impacts your efforts to achieve. That is, you determine what tasks you tackle, how you're going to tackle them, how long you're going to pursue a particular goal or goals during the course of your career. And the three dimensions that we've talked about here really are completely independent of one another, as you can see in the diagram here. And that is that what's implied here is the fact that you range between stability and instability. You range between controllable and uncontrollable elements to which you're reacting. And then finally, the internal versus external sources of those factors. So essentially, summarizing all this, social perception is a guess. That is, we essentially guess about the causes of events and the behaviors that we observe in any given situation. We're later going to review the errors that we make in some of our social perceptions, but we favor consistency in our own views, even to the point of fudging with reality a bit in order to achieve it. But we do prefer that. That's really a fancy way of saying that you and I don't like cognitive dissonance. It is ultimately an unpleasant experience to find you're behaving in one way and it's inconsistent with your beliefs. So that in turn causes us then to look internally, and that is what I also want to do, is to look at our perceptions of self in a given situation. And that's essentially the next factor that we're going to look at, and the first that I want to give you here is a definition related to self-schema. And that has to do with the beliefs, the feelings, and the generalizations that we have about ourselves. I mean, somebody asks you, who are you? How do you describe yourself? Any of us can list off a whole series of attributes. We're reliable or scattered, you pick it. But you can describe that. We've all got an image of ourselves, okay? What are the contributing elements that feed into your own complete description of who you are? One interesting definition of self, which in and of itself is an interesting concept, is the fact that a self is any part of the world which, when you touch it, yields a second experience of touch. It took me a while to really appreciate that definition, and I didn't like it at the beginning, and in some ways it's not actually correct. Because if for whatever reason you reach down when you're in the middle of an operation, you can touch your intestine or something like that, and you won't have any feel because the touch receptors are really only on the outside of us. But in normal status, that's a pretty good definition. And that is anything in the world that you touch that yields two experiences of touch is part of you. That's yourself in that situation. But we define the self in several different ways. For instance, in terms of personality, when we look at the self in personality, there are several different authors that have talked about that. One of whom is Alfred Adler. Another is Carl Jung, Erik Erikson, and even Carl Rogers have in various ways in their theoretical writings written about varying theoretical views of self. Carl Rogers essentially views the self as being a given in a given situation. And he comes up with a rather interesting example that I'll get to here in just a second. But if you think about it, when a 3-year-old sits down at the dining room table, if you can remember when you were 8 or 9 or 10 or 11, old enough to know better than to steal food off people's plates, if your 3-year-old brother or sister sits down and reaches across and grabs a roll off your plate and starts chewing on it simply because his or her analysis was, in looking around the table, well, that's the best one. That's what I'll take. We're all here to eat, so that's on the table. That's the one I'm going to use. Well, Freud would argue, would suggest that in that kind of a behavior, when a kid reaches across and grabs something, he would describe that in many ways, but the primary term that he would use in that case is id. It's essentially id-driven behavior. You'll remember as we talked about that the id is totally self-serving. It's worried about where's the next meal coming from, where's the next fluid coming from, and so forth. So the idea of reaching across to a brother's or sister's plate and grabbing a roll or any piece of food off other than the common dishes, Freud just describes that as id-driven behavior. On the other hand, Rogers, as a phenomenologist, explains it essentially as a phenomenal field which has not yet been divided from the kid's perspective, has not yet been divided into self and not self, which is a completely different theoretical explanation, and yet in both cases it deals with various theoretical views of self in that situation. So Roger's explanation is simply that it happens in any phenomenal field, any environment, where the individual that's involved has not yet divided the world into mine and thine, or you know, self and not self. To give you two very different kind of extreme examples of ways in which we can define ourself in terms of personality. Let's also then look at parts of self, and we can define that in a number of different ways in which we can define ourselves here. I'm going to spend some time on giving you a couple of different examples of that. But one is your physical self. Okay? Your view of your own body is a highly influential factor in your perception of who you are. What effect does your physical presence have on others is another way to think of it. When people see you, do they tend to look away? Do they tend to smile? Do they avoid your eyes? When people describe you, how do they do it? Usually in terms of things like your clothing or your hair, or your attractiveness, or essentially a prominent feature of yours. Maybe you've got a whole lot of tattoos, and that will be a feature that they will mention in describing you in that situation. Our self-identity is deeply intertwined with our features and our sex organs. Sounds a little blunt, but that is in fact true. That is, you and I behave significantly in terms of whether we're male or female in any environment. Our sex is one of the things that governs how we interact with people, how we act in a given situation. Some of our features change automatically as we age, things like height, for instance. A second is skin texture. It gradually roughens as you age. Your teeth. You will end up spending a lot of money in a dentist, in all likelihood, down through the years, preserving the teeth that you have in the body that as it ages. And that's one way in which our physical self changes during the course of time. We change some of our features by our own decision, things like hair length and color, the very structure, whether we're using a crew cut, does it have to be flat, or using long curly hair, long straight hair, a lot of different possibilities, but that's a way in which we change our physical self voluntarily. Our athleticism. Do you tend to have a significant scheduled athletic program that you're engaged in, physical activity program, I should say. Things like weight. Instantly, we can't change it, but in the long run, you are ultimately the end result of the eating that you've done. If you're eating too much, you're overweight. If you're not eating enough, you're underweight. But you ultimately control that feature of your physique. Some of our features we can't change. Race, sex, and gender, usually. But even that becomes a subject for debate. But to a large extent, our physique and our clothing essentially determine much of how people react to us initially. What they see approaching them, to a certain extent, determines how they're going to react in a given situation. Let's put ourselves in another environment and look at another way to define self, and that is in terms of social factors. And in that case, what we're doing here is let me just bust into a couple of different ways in which we can talk about this. One of which is roles. We have a lot of different roles that we can play in a given situation. And what I mean by roles is essentially the pattern of behavior expected from an individual, any one of us, because of our membership in a particular group. Okay? That's a role. What role do you play in a given situation? And I'll talk about a number of examples of that, but essentially that is the definition of a role, and it is clearly anchored in our social experience. A lot of different examples I could cite here. For instance, in a university, I'm called a professor in a university, in addition to a number of other things by certain people, but you know, that varies for many of us from one situation to another. On the other hand, in this university, you're a student. And what that does is to dictate or create certain kind of roles, that is expected behaviors from us as a function of which role we're playing in a particular university. So it's expected in a given classroom situation that I'm going to come into the classroom, be at the center table, and be offering advice in one form, knowledge in one form or another, whether I'm an engineer or a psychologist or any other professor. That's the role of a professor, is to dispense knowledge, encourage thinking, and so forth. On the other hand, you are a student. And as a student, there is a role that you play also. That is, you're sitting at the feet, intellectual feet of people of a variety of different skills to get a cross-section of what humanity is about, or what we think about ourselves in that situation. That's a very different kind of role than is that for the professor. The professor, you're the one that takes the tests, I'm the one that ultimately decides what performance level is A level, B level, and so forth. But those are really a function of our role. There was a time when I was a student. And in that case, I was playing the role that you're currently playing. Now, from the professors that educated me, I've swapped roles with them. I haven't swapped roles with them, but I've assumed the professor role in that situation. That kind of an example leads into some rather interesting illustrations, and that has to do with, I'm fumbling with my notes here because I'm going from handwritten notes at the moment. Give me just a second to get myself straightened out here. Professor-student is one of the things that I wanted to talk about. And then the other thing has to do with the stability of the kind of classroom in which you find yourself. That analysis of classroom in education has been changing in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And in essence, one of the changes that's been going on is that for a long time, teacher was presenter, was strictly the possessor of knowledge who in fact was dispensing it. In large classrooms and television education, that role is not likely to change anytime soon, simply because of the relative numbers of professors relative to students. But on the other hand, in the elementary and junior high classroom, there is one kind of interesting, exciting change that has gone on in the last couple of decades. And that has to do with the fact that making the teacher not a presenter, but rather a facilitator. And the effect of that is to essentially put students into a room that tends to be noisy. And the reason is that the activities of the individual may be as varied as the number of students that are in the classroom. And the net result then is a noisy classroom, which of course upsets other teachers who want quiet classrooms and so forth. But the net result is that it's somehow predicated on the idea that a noisy classroom cannot be educational. And that really depends on the model of education that you're adopting in a given situation. Sometimes necessity develops or mandates a particular model, but in other cases where kids are essentially turned loose, yeah, we're all studying about Greece, but some of us may be interested in agricultural elements of Greece, others may be interested in political elements, and on and on and on. So that essentially each student in the class is involved in his or her own activity relative to learning something about Greece itself. And that makes the teacher essentially a facilitator rather than a dispenser. And that essentially dictates a different kind of model in the classroom, which is leading up to the next point that I wanted to make, and that is essentially that in looking at the roles that we play, any of us, they vary. We have multiple roles that we play in a given situation. If you look at my own life, I play, in some cases I'm a professor, in other cases I'm a father, in other cases I'm a sailor or a power boater. I'm a political party. I have a role in politics. I serve as a friend to various people in different kinds of situations. And these result from the fact that you and I belong to many different groups. And as the groups change, the role that we play in those groups also tends to change, which leads into another topic that is worth addressing, and that has to do with the conflict that various kinds of roles can produce for us. A professor tends to be a rather authority figure. I don't know how best to describe the role, but essentially a determiner of grades, not often challenged as a purveyor of truth. To the extent you do get into that kind of a challenge, you tend to learn a lot because you're challenging a given statement, and the facts either back that person up or they don't. But it's out of that education is made ultimately. Do you accept a statement or do you challenge it? And the net result is that the nature of the education itself is altered in that way. But a professor in dispensing knowledge or encouraging the mastery of it can't take that same role as a politician. That is, if you're acting as a political supporter for somebody, you can't tell people how to vote. You can essentially explain your reasons for voting in a particular way in the hope that you change somebody's mind. But in the one case, a professor is dispensing knowledge with a particular kind of goal. In the case of a politician, he or she is trying to change minds toward or against a particular kind of candidate. And that can lead to conflict depending on which role you view yourself as playing in a given situation. Recent efforts in women's lib groups, recent being the last quarter century or so, have begun to make traditional stay-at-home moms, which is a very honored and long-standing role in human life, some of those moms have felt quite uncomfortable because the ways in which they've been painted into, oh, you're a stay-at-home mom, you're not intellectual, you're not reading, and that simply isn't true. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to be a stay-at-home mom and still be productively involved in things beyond raising one's own family. But that is a role conflict, different people's view of what constitutes a stay-at-home mom and his or her features. In my own situation, another example of the conflict that you get was that at one point when I was teaching at the University of South Carolina, which was my first academic appointment after graduating with my PhD, about 4 or 5 years into my career at South Carolina, I joined a sailing club, which a newly formed sailing club just on Lake Murray, which is just outside Columbia, South Carolina. And much to my surprise, about 2 years later, the Commodore of the club turned out to be a graduate student in of the club. So Monday through Friday, as professor, I was the one who was giving the assignments and then following up on evaluation. But Saturday and Sunday, as Commodore of the sailing club, he was the one who was giving orders about clean this or paint that and so forth. And it really illustrated in classic sense the reversal of roles, and it was a true reversal that can take place in that kind of a situation, or the situations in which we find ourselves. That was probably in my own life the most direct example of role conflict, which clearly happened in that particular situation. We also have various kinds of out-of-role behavior that may occur in a given situation, and it'll be recognized as such. This is an example of what used to be called out-of-role behavior. It no longer is. 30 years ago, you might be curious to learn that the reason that gas stations are called service stations is that there was a time way back when gas was 20 cents a gallon, 22 cents a gallon, and the station personnel would come out and service your car. That is, they would do the gas pumping for you. In fact, some stations prohibited the customers from pumping the gas. And so this kind of a situation 30 years ago, 40 years ago, was out of role. You would not expect, first of all, the customer to be out there pumping the gas at all, and certainly if anyone did, it would be the male, not the female, at that time. And that, at that time, was an example of out-of-role behavior. People would have looked at that, and if they'd seen it, in fact, when I use that slide in Intro Psych, I would find that people would like, I mean, you would hear the intake of gas simply because it was so unexpected to see a female pumping gas at that time. And I have to keep stressing that because that role has changed significantly. But the change over time is one example of the basis on which role conflict can occur. And that in turn leads to another thing that I want to look at, and that is norms. Because essentially what happens is that the roles that we get into basically end up leading us to establish norms, which are essentially empirically established standards that are often referred to as essentially average behavior. And messing with those is just the source of much of what Candid Camera used to do as a television show. There have been reprises of that work at various times, but it was just an endless source of psychological gambits that you could talk about. One of my favorites involved an experiment that was done in an elevator, and stick on the screen here for a minute because I want to show an example of the kind of thing that was done. And that is the norm that's involved here is, and you know this too, that when you get in an elevator, if you don't know anybody in the elevator, the norm is you face the front, okay? So in this particular elevator, what Candid Camera did, and this was in one of the 80 or 100-story buildings in New York City, so they had a long way to photograph this. They had a camera in the elevator to watch what actually happened, and the scenario that was set up was 5 people in an elevator, 3 across the back and 2 across on the corners in the front, all of them facing the back, which was the one change that was made. That was the kind of quirk to see what would actually happen in this situation. And they kept track of, we actually duplicated this in the library with the 8-story elevator at the core of the main library here at the University of Houston. And that's where these pictures come from. So in essence, if everybody is facing the back, this person has gotten on and faced the front. And she looked around a bit as she was riding up and down, or riding up to the book floor that she was going to. But it turns out, for those that faced the front, only 18% of the people who got on the elevator did that. Okay? There are 3 other responses that are possible if you think about it a minute. One is to get on and face sideward. Okay? That way you can keep your eye on the crazy people, but you can also watch the rising floor numbers to see when you need to get off. Okay? Well, it turns out 62% of all riders faced the side. That was a violation of norm, and it occurred simply because the only change relative to that elevator normally is everybody was facing the back. So you split the difference. That was what most people tended to do in that situation. In turn, the third possibility is to get on and face the back as this individual did. You feel stupid, but at least you're conforming. Nobody's going to be thinking you're strange in any particular way. And it turned out only 6% of the people did that. Only 6 people out of 100 in this experiment truly conformed to the behavior that was being modeled in that situation. And the fourth is, of course, no thanks, I'll wait for the next car, or I'll walk, which is the other possibility. And it turns out about 12% did that. So the net result in that situation is, if you add it all up, that 82% of the people faced with that violation of the norm altered their own behavior. 82% faced a different direction simply because other people were. That's a classic example of the fact that you and I pay a lot of attention to what other people are doing in any given situation. That is the power of norms in our everyday life. Enough said, I think. I've kind of beaten that one to death. Let me also talk about self-defined in another way, and that is in terms of personal self. Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper contains a marvelous storyline in which a prince and a pauper basically exchange places because of circumstances that are not worth talking about here, and because of their physical selves were so similar. So the prince and the pauper physically looked very similar to one another. Each learner learns well the role that the other plays in this particular story. And as at the story's end, there's a debate as to who is the prince and who is the pauper. Both knew the social roles of both, and each knows who is whom. But they're the only two that absolutely know it. The court officials were trying to separate out one from the other in terms of what they can never see, and that is the personal self, the innards of the beliefs, if you want, of the prince and the pauper. Ultimately, it was all sorted out, and the purpose, the pauper gains lifetime protection of the prince in the course of the situation there. But that inner identity is the personal you. It's a viewpoint. It's a basis for your experience, and you and I never see that directly. We see the consequences of it. Let us look then at elements of our self-experience, and I can go 15 different directions with this, but there are a lot of different ways to illustrate it. One is the fact that names really have an interesting impact on you and I. Humpty Dumpty and Alice had a discussion about names in Alice in Wonderland, through the Looking Glass is what I'm trying to say here. Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. Okay, the upshot of the conversation in that book, in that story, is the fact that Humpty Dumpty's name significantly limits what he can look like. It really, the name itself essentially leads to the kind of character that you expect in that situation. For Alice, her options within limits are fairly wide open in that situation. And then you remember somebody like Alice Cooper, which is kind of a strong counter-argument to what I'm essentially saying here. But they do convey a lot if you think about it. Let me review some other names with you. Okay, let's look at bank names, and I'll show you some examples of that, share with you some examples. This is one that has recently been bought out by another bank, so it isn't its fault. But First Interstate is an example of a very solid bank name. Okay, you'd be quite likely to deposit your funds in something clearly implying multi-state involvement, okay? We've got other things like Bank of America. We don't aspire to be Bank of Miami or Bank of Clinton County. We are simply Bank of America. We bank to the nation, okay? Wells Fargo is another name which through time has garnered a great deal of support as a pressure demonstration, I guess, of its strength as a bank. Bank One. That's a more recently arrived title, but it's another classic example of simply Bank One. Not bank sometimes, or bank part-time, or bank 30%. It is simply Bank One. It's banking on unity in the theme there. But you think about it, comparing those names, we're not going to see a bank name, well, and another example is Chase Manhattan. I forgot I had another example there. But on the other hand, we're not going to see examples like Irma's Bank and Beauty Shop. That label just is not going to occur. because bank and beauty shop are inconsistent with each other. And nowhere in the country do we have a bank named after somebody's first name. Okay, Fred's Hubcaps and Trust, not going to see it. Okay, again, because there's such a conflict in the two industries. They don't overlap with each other. The name shares nothing in common. They don't suggest strength. And we wouldn't even see it as Fred's Trust or Irma's Bank. Neither of those is going to happen. So names have very real limits on what they convey to people and their likelihood of being used in a given situation. In one study, back in 1980, Garwin took photos of women of equally rated attractiveness. That is, previous to the actual study, they had the women being presented had been rated to be of equal attractiveness, and they were shown to a second group, another group of subjects in the experiment, with names such as Jennifer, Kathy, Christine. When attached to that name, the same photos were rated to be more attractive than when attached to, I hope I'm not offending anybody here, Gertrude, Ethel, or Harriet. Those were simply less popular names, and the carryover from that was that the same name attached to, or different names attached to the same photo, simply impacted what the rated attractiveness of the person being photographed. In another study, men who were named David, John, Michael, or Robert were rated to be more positive, were rated more positively than were those who were named things like Ian, David, Ian Dale, or Raymond. So among men's names, things like David, John, Michael, or Robert tend to imply solidity and to gain more positive ratings than names such as less frequent names such as Ian, Dale, or Raymond. Out of curiosity, I didn't believe it, but I went back through my class records and pulled together the following data. Okay, this is a review of first names. Okay, think about this as a list of the first names of people enrolled in an introductory psychology class, and just ruminate on that for a minute. Okay, when would you think that I had collected these names? What year were students, and this was an unedited list. I just went down through and pulled the first 20 or 25 names, whatever it was. I think I had 20 names there, but when do you think that would have happened? How recently? Any guesses? I'll let you ruminate at home. Well, in fact, that came from the earliest class list that I could find among the records that I've kept here at the University of Houston, because, you know, we are required to keep ours for a year. I keep it for 40 years or whatever. I've still got all the records of the grades I've given over the years, and that was the first names of people in the second semester I ever taught intro psych here at the University of Houston. That's 1975. Make a guess about this list. Susan, Blessy, Candace, Sylvia, Eric, Isabel, Jesus, Mildred, Kimberly, Andrea, Miguel, lost my place, Garica, Christina, Rodney, Catherine, Orlando, Jason, Jaime, Lauralee, and Natalie. How recently do you think that list was generated? And in fact, that came out this year. That's one of the classes I'm teaching right now. Okay, what's reflected there as much as anything else is the hugely increasing, really exciting increasing diversity that we have in the undergraduates here on the main campus at the University of Houston. There's been a phenomenal change over the last 40 years, and I never really quite realized quite how all-encompassing that change was. But if you look at the campus today, as you're walking across campus, it's totally multicolor. Totally interracial, and just a really a marvelous selection of humans in various kinds of forms. So I just found that an interesting observation of the kind of points that I'm making here. Nicknames, as another example, are something that can also impact us in various kinds of ways. Hakeem the Dream has limits, but also things that can be generated out of that. Clyde the Glide. The name was then used to rhyme with one of the many things that he does very skillfully as a basketball player. Mad Max. All of those are after-the-fact names added to particular people, but they do imply certain things about the person that's involved. One writer noted that children who are named and called Charles or Frederick will lead very different lives than will children who are named Chuck or Fred, and children who are named Charlie and Freddie. Those nicknames tend to lead into, they precede the actual life that is experienced, but the names do tend to predict. Now you're in a chicken and egg controversy there, because maybe the action of the kid generated the name, which in turn also predicted the kind of life that they would lead. But there is some interaction between the nicknames that people have and the kind of lives that they end up leading. For a given age cohort, a cluster of people all born at the same time, unusual names will tend to lead to problems in childhood, but they tend to generate success in later life. When you're a lawyer, it's very helpful to have an unusual name, because you can be remembered when somebody gets in a jam and needs a lawyer. Oh yes, and they will remember that unusual name. Common names, on the other hand, have greater popularity at different times, which is kind of the basis of what was just demonstrated with the names that I was sharing with you there. Another issue has to do with the difference between names like Robert or Susan as opposed to names like Leslie. Now, am I spelling that L-I-E and identifying a male, or am I spelling it E-Y and defining a female? Or is it the other way around? So certain names can cause various kinds of difficulties or questions in problems in identifying who you're really actually talking about. We can even find gender-neutral names like Ronnie, although one of our presidents was nicknamed that, but or counter-gender names like Marion or Jean or Robin, which more often tend to be associated with men than women, even though they sound more like female names. And those kind of names are no predictor of adult success. The underlying problem is that what we're dealing with here is correlational evidence at best. This name related to that kind of career success and so forth. Let's talk about a couple of other general things, and then I want to finish with a kind of a neutral but interesting activity here. One has to do with values, and that is what we're dealing with here is essentially a system of beliefs about people, objects, and things. It's an excellent predictor of how parents will vote if you simply poll their children. That's one good way to make a prediction about what's going to happen in the election is go poll high school students. Because before college, you tend to be thinking like your parents in a given situation. Before you get out on your own and kind of reevaluate the world, one of the best predictors of how parents are going to vote is ask their children. It's an example of conveyed values, which in turn leads into another related factor, and that has to do with ethics, which is essentially our internalized standards of behavior. We often mimic others as youths. Witness the point I just made about voting. But we eventually derive our own ethics through thought, logic, and so forth and so on. You will remember Lawrence Kohlberg's work on moral reasoning. The highest level there is principled reasoning, but it's cognitively based after a long bit of internal wrestling with oneself and one's beliefs. But essentially clarifying our values is one of the keys of developing a stable self-concept. You really have to understand your orientation toward the world in order to ultimately develop that self-concept. And we define that essentially as an individual's total view of him or herself in a given situation. Individual's total views of her or himself. It includes at least 3 different elements that we could talk about. One has to do with descriptive self-concept. And in that case, what we're talking about is basically your self-image, as we were talking about it earlier. Your own analysis of your personal traits, the things that you would cite for other people that we may or may not be able to see directly. We are also looking then at another kind of thing that is involved in our self-concept is evaluation, a sense of evaluation, which is the basis on which we reach decisions about self-esteem, how good you feel about yourself and so forth, and your assessment of how you stand relative to those internal traits that we've been talking about. What's your overall evaluation of yourself? Concept in the given situation in life. And thirdly, then, the analysis that we're all engaged in here. And that has to do with essentially expectancies of self-efficacy. All of those are involved in one way or another in our self-concept. Now what I want to do is to finish with a measurement tool, the value of which I hope you will come to appreciate. I did my dissertation on this. Sadly, it isn't used as much as it used to be, but it offers some rather interesting features to it. It's called the semantic differential, and you have probably seen it at one time or another. But it involves essentially a scale, a marking scale like this. It'll be on a given sheet of paper with 7 blanks, separated by 6 colons, and it has this particular feature to it. It is utilized in the literature in terms of what's called a bipolar adjective scale, and the scales are normally anchored at each end by a word. It can be good, bad, it can be active, passive, it can, you name it, male, female, masculine, feminine, angry, happy. Wide variety of different bipolar adjectives exist. But the idea is that you're going to measure various kinds of attributes with this particular feature. And so in essence, the way in which the scale itself can be identified has to do with the following kind of situation, and that is the ratings that are normally attached to these are as follows. If on this particular scale you rate check off number 1, you are saying whatever is being rated is extremely good. We might have a central concept up here like self or yourself. On the other hand, we could have a word like apple. You know, you can use it to rate essentially anything in this particular situation. But if we rated a word like apple and you really love apples, then overall you're going to rate an apple as extremely good, unless you just recently bought an apple, bit into it, and there was a worm in the middle of it, in which case your rating may slip a little bit, in which case you're then reflecting, well, in fact, let's just show it here. If you're at the extreme ends, you are extremely one adjective or extremely the other adjective, good or bad, whatever it happens to be. If you rate in the second in position, it is normally viewed as rating 2 in this case and rating 6 in the other case. And what you're dealing with is a moderate amount of whatever the adjective happens to be in that situation. So a rating at the 2 and 6 position is moderate, whatever you're rating. In the third case, we have a scale or a rating which is telling us that you're indicating slightly good, slightly bad in a given situation. And finally then, in the center position, we run into one of the major problems that this scale does have, and that is the fact that we can talk about it as the equal rating or the rating in the middle may in fact define you're saying to yourself it's equally good and equally bad, sometimes good, sometimes bad. On the other hand, what you may also be rating there, as people studied the scale, is that what you're really saying is it's neither good nor bad in a given situation. Okay? That can be a problem with this particular scale. One particular solution was to use what are called unipolar scales. That is, they would simply give you only one anchor and 4 positions. So when you were rating apple as the central concept up here at the top, it might be apple and you'd only have this position and 3 more rating its badness, and then separately you had to rate its goodness, where you've got this position and these 3. So there are several ways in which to alter the rating shape itself. To give you an example of what's really involved there, we can use, as I said, the adjectives that are actually used in this situation can be changed significantly. So for instance, we could talk about good, bad, which is the general thing that is being rated there is evaluation. And we can use different adjectives to happy, sad would be another example of a pair of adjectives that would essentially rate your evaluation of yourself in a given situation. But then we could change that and make it instead an activity dimension. That's the second major dimension that is thought to be measured by this particular scale. And that is to measure the evaluation, the activity level. And there are a number of different, hot, cold would be another example of an activity rating. So one dimension is evaluation, a second dimension is activity. We could also change it into potency. That's a third factor that is normally reflected in this particular scale, and it has to do with the strength of what is basically being dealt with. And as you can appreciate, you can also use a variety of different pairs of words, in this case rating essentially the potency of what's involved. Strong, weak would be another example of a scale that could be used. That is basically going to allow you to use these particular scales to rate any particular concept that you're interested in rating. What I would ask you to do as you're listening to the lecture after we get done with it is to take the scale you've got two sets of scales in the book that accompanies the course, and you'll find that what I'm going to ask you to do, I'd like you to, don't turn to it yet. My point was, look at the scales, and only on the first page, I want you to rate yourself as you currently are. Okay? And then I will talk to you next time about what I'd like to have you rate in the other scale, and we will actually start our next program lecture with a comparison of the two. What I'd ask you to do between now and the time you start viewing the next lecture is to actually pick yourself as you currently are, and just rate yourself across the 20 or so scales that are in the list that you see on the screen there. Not on the screen, sorry, on the book that I'm asking you to turn to. The left of the 2 pages, I'd like to have you rate yourself as you currently are. You can write that in or call it me. Put your own name up there. I don't really care, but rate your current status in that particular list. And then at the beginning of the next lecture, I will ask you to do a different kind of rating, and we'll generate out of that one of the potential uses of this scale in really perceiving who we actually are, who we perceive ourselves to be. So we'll pick it up with the semantic differential at the beginning of the next lecture.